Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing unto you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. There can be a lot of grumbling in the church, can't there? Maybe? This is when you say yes. Yes, lots of grumbling. I mean, we just heard it, right? There can be a lot of grumbling. I mean, maybe it's there's not enough candy, or maybe it's there not enough volunteers, or who's sitting in my seat, or why are we doing that? No one told me. We've never done that before, right? Lots of different ways we can grumble in the church. And there was a lot of grumbling in the vineyard too, wasn't there? I mean, really, how would you feel? How would you feel if you were one of those laborers who started early in the day and worked all day long, only to realize that the guy who showed up for an hour got exactly the same thing? Would you grumble? Say it's not fair? Think you deserve more? And you're all sitting there silent, because I know I would. It's a human thing, isn't it? So what is it that God is doing? Just like those all-day workers in the gospel, we have borne the burden of the day. We have worked in the hot sun and endured long sermons and tedious lessons and labored hard to walk the straight and narrow path. So it's only fair that we should get the bigger reward, right? Certainly bigger than those who just wandered into the church this morning for the first time, right? Well, maybe today's gospel of Jesus is Jesus' way of reminding us to accept everyone who comes in our doors, to accept everyone who accepts Jesus, whenever that is. Maybe we need help realizing that sometimes when anyone joins the fellowship of believers, they too become inheritors of the entire promise. Even though there are those of us who have labored long and hard for our reward, these new folks get the entire blessing too. Even though they haven't put in their pew time, like we have. And maybe sometimes we start to resent God's generosity. Because the truth is, we don't like change. Sometimes we would rather just adjust to the way things are and continue to grumble. Because it is a human thing, isn't it? This grumbling, comparing, misremembering the past to make it better than it was. But what if we shaped our world and the way we live in it according to God's grace and God's generosity? How might that change the way we do things and what we do? What might the world look like if we stopped grumbling? Is that even possible? Well, of course it is. Because I see firsthand this church and these members living in grace and generosity. Because living this way requires a different way of measuring and not comparing, of setting aside jealousies and envy. And sometimes, even those of us who agree that we must live in grace and generosity, we do slip back into humanity. So we must, again, look at what Jesus is doing and ask ourselves how we labor in the Lord's vineyard without feeling like we are owed something more. How do we simply enjoy the service and the connections that it brings us? Throughout this stewardship campaign and moving forward, this is the challenge. To settle in for the long haul. To acknowledge that much of what we've learned about how the world works doesn't fit us anymore. To give of ourselves and our treasures generously to help Jesus turn everything upside down. To help Jesus succeed in a scandalous reversal of expectation. To embrace God's grace and mercy and forgiveness for everyone. Not just those of us who have labored the longest. Because what we learn from today's gospel is that all of us are equal recipients of God's gifts. And if we are truly to live into the Great Commission, to love God and love neighbor, and if we are truly to live into our mission to be disciples who create disciples for the transformation of the world, then we must set aside our own sense of entitlement and instead become a servant like Jesus, inviting all into his fellowship of believers, welcoming all, embracing all, and giving all. Because God is a God of abundance, and thus we must be children of abundance, inviting and incorporating our neighbors into our congregation without exception. Since 2020, that's 3 years. That's it, 3 years. The population of Farmington has grown 25%. What? That's a lot. And that's only Farmington. We have so many opportunities to grow in abundance. But sometimes we are still grumbling, like the laborers in the vineyard. So today, I'm issuing you all a challenge and an assignment. As you leave, you will find that there are door hangers on the tables outside in the narthex. Take some. Take a lot. Take a handful, take a chunk, take them. And hang them on every one of your neighbor's doors. And maybe find a new subdivision and hang them on every door in the new subdivision. And if you run into one of those neighbors as you're hanging that on their door, invite them and introduce yourself. Invite everyone right here to worship here at Farmington United Methodist Church. And never stop to consider whether or not they are worthy or whether or not they think or act or look like we do. Never stopping to judge, only to invite and welcome and exhibit Jesus' radical and scandalous love. Because together, throughout this stewardship campaign, as we continue to pray about how and what we will give in the coming year, we must also sow the seeds outside the immediate walls of this church, growing in faithful stewardship and growing and acting with graciousness and with generosity in all that we do. I invite you to join me this week as we work consistently toward that goal. Amen.